Elizabeth Povinelli est anthropologue, théoricienne critique, réalisatrice. Elle est à l'université de Columbia, à New York, et elle réfléchit à une histoire du présent, une histoire à partir de deux modes de dépossession. La dépossession des biens communs de Trentrino, qui sont des terres ancestrales des Povinelli au XIXe siècle, la dépossession des terres collègues, des terres côtières, des Karrabing au cours de la même période. Donc, elle réfléchit de manière plus générale, et vous avez peut-être pu voir dans le cadre de l'exposition qui s'est déroulée au Palais de Tokyo il y a maintenant 1 an, et qui s'appelait, qui avait le mot Terre dans son titre, je ne me souviens plus exactement, eh bien, une vidéo et des textes d'Elizabeth Povinelli qui introduisaient les modes de dépossession des aborigènes en Australie, je crois, de façon tout à fait pertinente par rapport aux logiques contemporaines. Donc je vais tout de suite lui céder la parole et puis on aura, comme d'habitude, un tour de questions.
Merci beaucoup. Vous êtes plus que bien. Parler anglais. Sorry. First of all, thank you so much. That was amazing. Merci. I want to start with the quotidian and begin in 1984 at the edge of Mudpill and Estuarine Creek, located across the harbor of Darwin in the Northern Territory of Australia, where in 1984 I was often sitting with Belluan women in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, including Betty Billowalk, who you see here. The Belluan community, where these older women lived and grew up, lies inside, in the exact middle of the Cox Peninsula, which is a peninsula on the other side of Darwin. So Darwin's here. There's a harbor, and the Cox Peninsula is here. During the unbearably hot months before the monsoons begin, in November and October, everyone spent and still spends as much time as possible on nearby beaches, one of which is called Mudpill. And so it was with us on one of these, or many of these innumerable hot, languid November days, we found ourselves sitting there. And now the day's much, much hotter, and with fewer beaches because of development clawing into the region. There are fewer beaches for us to sit. Nevertheless, in 1984, as we waited we'd be fishing, we were waiting for the fish to bite, Betty Billowalk here would often sketch in a series of named places that define the vast coastal region which comprised the lands of various Belluan families. She would outline which families belonged to which places and how they were connected to these places by what you might call totems and we call teruen. How the country responded to different human languages. In Emiangle, one of those languages, we say mol, and to human sweat, literally the exfoliation of human bodies, what we call mintra, and how each place was connected to other places through teruen, or totemic kinship, that existed, but also through marriage and ceremony. The spatial location and the shape of these named spaces were how they were related. The shapes of them were extraordinarily important to Billowalk and these other women. And she would also drill into her kids, and definitely into me, how they sat in relation to each other. So she would say, just imagine you're sitting at X place. Look around. What do you see over there? What do you see over there? If you're walking straight, if you turn, if you go back, what is the shape of that place? So you would imagine in your own mind an etch-a-sketch, right, through your own movement into space. Now, in 1984, when the women asked me where I came from, oh, maybe this, no, this, yes, cool. Where I came from, I would sketch in the same sand that she had been sketching in, a line that moved from the alpine village of Corzolo in the province of Trentino, where Povinelli first emerged as a nickname sometime in the 1480s, the mid-1400s. That became a surname by the 1500s, and then split into different clans by the early to mid-1700s, including, of course, my clan, Simonaz, one of the first clans of Povinellis to emerge. Then I would go from there to Buffalo, New York, where our clan, Simonaz Povinellis, migrated by the turn of the 20th century, and to Buffalo, where I was born in 1962, then to Shreveport, Louisiana, where I grew up from 1965 to 1980, to Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I went to college, and got a BA in philosophy, then back to Mudpill, where we were sitting. When the older women commented, "So you're Italian," I would recount stories of family fights that broke out over this very question. Given the location of Trentino during my father's side, father and mother, his paternal parents, both from the village, one Ambrosi, one Povinelli, how fights would break out about where Corzolo sat in the world. Was it Austrian? Was it Tyrolean? Was it Trentino? Was it Italian? And this was especially important since Corzolo, like many of these small villages in Trentino, were part of a Carta di Regula system from 1127 to Napoleon. That is, they were granted the rights to be self-organizing based on vicini, based on local families. Now, that conversation, where do you come from? Where do you come from? These two, this conversation both initialized my relationship to Belyuen families and now the Karrabing side of the family. On the one hand, we had ways in which, and I'll talk about this more, ways in which Belyuen and now Karrabing relate to, inhabit, have kinship relations to other humans in the more than human world. And on the other hand, we have a story about certain, at least a specific region of Europe that had similar, if not identical, relations to country at one period of time. And on the one hand, we have Belyuen and Karrabing who have been struggling to maintain their relations to country, the effort to endure. And you have another set of families, Simonaz Povinelli or Bruca Ambrosi on my father's grandmother's side, who engaged in a movement, a global movement, that took them from the Alps to the US and then to Australia. At the heart of our first conversations then was, why did Povinellis move? And one of the answers, early answers was, well, Napoleon dispossessed in 1805 the forms of community relations to country. That is, Napoleon liberated this region from feudal ways of inhabiting together and invited or liberated these families, including my own, into possessive individualism. So Simonaz Povinellis were dispossessed of their communal rights and then given the right to be a possessive individual. On the other hand, Karrabing families, the opposite. There was an attempt to radically dispossess them. And indeed, my arrival, sorry, here's the movement, my movement across the world. My arrival into Belyuen lives crucially reflected a line of other people moving through their worlds, and in particular, a movement that included Makassar from Indonesia, which came down and traded with indigenous folks in the north of the country. The Dutch, who started exploring for new trade routes into China that passed by or might have landed in Karrabing lands in the north. The French, the English, and et cetera. Now, after 34 years of me traveling and commuting to their ancestral lands, we, Karrabing, as we had created Karrabing, we finally made it to my ancestral lands. That is, we reversed the trajectory. Whereas I, since 1984, had been going back and forth to Belyuen Karrabing lands. In 2018, right before the pandemic started, or 2 years before the pandemic started, Linda Yerwin, Rex Singh, and Aiden Singh, not seen here, and I went back to Cortisolo. It wasn't the first time I'd been back there, but we went back to Cortisolo. And then just a month ago, in May 2023, Natasha Bigfoot, Cameron Bionamu, Cecilia Lewis, Katrina Lewis, me, and two of my great-granddaughters, Acadia Lee and Shekinah Lewis, who was Katrina Lewis's daughters, spent a week in Cortisolo meeting my cousins from different clans, or Skatuma, and also looking around what in Karrabing we call my country. Now, my country. We're going to Beth's country. This is how we refer in Karrabing and Belyuen to an area in Trentino that, from my grandparents' point of view, I pick up through my father and my grandfather since 1127. But by the time we made it back to my country, that is, we reversed the movement of whiteness, Europeanness. By the time we made it back to my country, the diverse social and political forms of white nativism had emerged and reasserted itself both, and certainly in Europe, but also in the US. And indeed, a form of white nativism that I've been thinking about as a kind of cultural counter-reformation to colonial critique. Now, I use the term counter-reformation, or a kind of white counter-reformation, or European counter-reformation, purposely, if somewhat metaphorically. If the Council of Trent, which obviously is close to the Cortisolo's ground, if the Council of Trent articulated a new political theology born of the political and social implications of a spiritually grounded social revolution, Protestantism, and attempted to reform itself in order to maintain its power and domination in Europe and abroad, by the time we reversed this process of colonial movement, and Karrabing was now going to my country, all of us, and certainly me, were beginning to wonder how this white or European counter-reformation demanded a new way of thinking about the political nature of living together across colonial spaces. Now, part of the problem that we face here is not merely that when in Karrabing or at Belyuen, we freely, amongst ourselves, freely talk about my country, Corsolo, and these kids love it. Oh, we went to Beth's country, Corsolo, it's beautiful, it's got mountains, and they all come from there, and they might have dreamings, we'll talk about more totems. When we talk freely about my country in Corsolo, we are attempting to read a history, a European history, through an indigenous framework. When we're standing in my country, in the Alps, and claim Beth's country based on a certain kind of descent to place that extends, at least 800 years, we immediately encounter two other forms of political habitation. On the one hand, white nativism, and on the other hand, which we would be, I think we'd be more than happy to critique, a kind of white nativism that refers back to to European, often pre-Christian symbols and traditions. A white nativism that, as we know, has been mobilized by the right throughout Europe, but definitely in Italy. I most confidently will say that. But we also, I think, face here we go. Who's this? This is in Australia. We also face desires, I think, on the left and the progressive left, a left that is engaging questions about how do we inhabit the world, how do we belong to the world or how do we belong to a place in a non-fascist way. Movements on the left and the progressive left whose desire is to de-accelerate, to decolonize a kind of global cosmopolitanism, and is seeking to reassert, to recapacitate older traditions of commoning, older traditions of being with the earth and its various relations of existence in a non-fascist way. That is, all those projects returning to somewhere and trying to belong to some place, whether it be through traditional ecological means, communing, and etc. So I think what we see both on the right and on the left, if we're looking at a transformation in Europe, and by Europe I mean white Americas, white Australia, right, the European diaspora, if we look at a contemporary sound in Europe and its diaspora, I think what we're hearing is the effect of the power of colonial critique, the power of the demand that we decolonize certain European political, social, and ecological practices. But the manifestation of that power, that the way in which this decolonial critique, which is it's not failing, it's showing itself to be quite effective, but the manifestation of its power is this return in Europe on the left and the right to a desire to have its own indigenous traditions. To say, we too were colonized, and in different places in different ways, and important. We too had our own indigenous cultures. And thus, when we, Karrabing, move between Corizolo, Belyuen, or other places in Karrabing country, say Mabuluk, the places we're talking about, we face a particular problem that I think is often kept below the surface of discussion. That is, how on the one hand do we support politically, socially, and economically indigenous claims, say Karrabing indigenous claims, and desires to keep their forms of kinship to their lands obligatory, compelling, and politically powerful, while at the same time, we work against a certain discourse and politics of European indigeneity. How can we do both? Should we do both at the same time, and how can we? Now, of course, where I'm sitting, anything? Oh, no, that's going the wrong way. How do we, in other words, bring the Corizolan Alps in relation to the saltwater lands of the Karrabing? We've been particularly interested in a project that mobilizes these two places in order to try and understand the transformations that are now occurring in political discourse globally and economic discourse globally through a project that we're calling Rising Tides and Melting Glaciers. So what we see in these two places, in Karrabing coastal lands, are over the next 30 years, the swamping of saltwater lands, and of course what we see in the Alps is the melting of the glaciers. So we have two forms of water, both of which are being dramatically affected by climate collapse. And with the dramatic change of these water conditions, and melting glaciers and rising tides, we also know that there's going to be a critical transformation of ecology. So in the Alps, the collapse of the ski economy, which for the last 100 years has brought extraordinary wealth to the Alps, and in relation to northern Australia and Karrabing country, the rising seas, which will bring a collapse to very long-standing ecosystems. So what I want to do now is, having set this up, so we have these two places, both of which, if we're looking at both of these places from a Karrabing point of view, and with me in Karrabing, from a Karrabing point of view, both could be said to be a form of, have a form of habitation with particular places on the earth passed down to particular people. That is, Corizolo, from my grandparents' point of view, passed down to Povinelli and Brosi, Nella, Bertarelli. But then this form of being together in place, being dispossessed by Napoleon, that sets this Ambrosi, Povinelli, etc., off the dispossessed taking advantage of the other dispossessed, to Seneca lands in New York, to cattle lands in Louisiana, to Tewa lands in New Mexico, and then to Belleeuwen lands in Australia. Right? On the other hand, Belleeuwen, Mabuluk, and other places in Karrabing country also being passed down to certain families, with each having the obligation to keep certain more than human kin healthy, alive, and vibrant. The question then we're asking in this rising tides melting glacier, as Dipesh Chakrabarty would say, as the global conditions of radical climate change are affecting everyone, but not everyone in the same way, how do we think about the concept of indigeneity, or the way in which we belong to lands, the way in which we live together in Karrabing differently? And I'm going to just very quickly push on two approaches. That is, I'm going to reflect on a methodological question. That is, how do we bring these two places in relation to us so that we can see the way in which what's happening to all of us, melting glaciers, rising tides, is happening differently to all of us because of the way we're situated in what I've called Geontopower. So I'm just going to walk us through some of these methodological questions. One of the ways that people have often brought places in relation to each other, and when we're talking about climate change, ecology, the necessity to have new imaginaries, new ways of thinking about living with other humans and with the more than human world, there can be a tendency to turn to indigenous people and ask, and how do you do it? Right? Teach us. And then either to try to remobilize these teachings in a European world, or to imagine or to put in relation to these, I will say, indigenous forms of human and more than human cohabitation in relation to older European ways of cohabiting, right? To do a kind of classic comparative approach, right? So in this kind of approach, you would say, Karrabing have presented what I'm about to say together. We were, 7 of us, obviously, were moving around just very recently. And when we present Karrabing ways of relating to their lands, we often present 4 concepts that are crucial, or 4 relations that are crucial, relations that have different names. 1, Terwen, Mir, Mintana, and Ngirwat. And these terms refer to different sorts of human land relations, but also land-land relations. So very simply, I'll try simply, Terwen refer to a form of ancestral being that moved around, and then at a certain place, you could say stiffened up or hardened, right? So Rex Edmonds, this is Mabuluk. Rex Edmonds often talks about and presents Mabuluk as an example of a Terwen. That is his Terwen, that his dreaming or his ancestral being, the barramundi fish, who came from another place and lay down there. And if you know how to look, you can see that that fish is still there. It hardened up. Mir is also a kind of ancestral being, but it has a more diffuse, they're more diffuse agents in the land that manifest in different ways. So, and when they manifest into the we would say the fetus. So when the baby comes out, the ancestral relation is marked on the baby's body. For instance, Marjorie Bilbil, one of the older women who I first met in 1984, had we would say a birthmark on her cheek, but it was her pussycat Mir, because her dad and another one of the women's dads were hunting down in this region over here. They were hungry. There was a cat in a hollow log. One of the men said, look, I'm going to smoke up the log. The cat will come out. You get it, break its neck, we'll have lunch. But they didn't make a fire. But when the cat came out, it had a deep burn mark on its cheek, right? That cat was Mir. Then it marked Marjorie, but Marjorie was marked as then having a relation to this area down here, Banakula, right? So Mir creates another kind of relation to land. The Teruin you pick up through your father and your father's father, like Korisolo you pick up, my grandparents would say you pick it up from your father and me, my grandfather would say. You pick up your Teruin through your male relations, going back. Mir you pick up through the agency of the woman's body. Nirwat is a named relation. So if an older person names you after a place, that creates a kinship bond. Mintara is sweat language, all these bodily excretions as you move through country go into the country, and the country literally smells and starts to recognize you. As it does so, it might give you a mir through your mother's body that might create over time a set of descents through your fathers, right? So they're very dynamic even as they're technically different. Now I think I passed this, unfortunately. Maybe I didn't. Yeah. What in a comparative method, what people would do is say, okay, so that's how they do it. That's kind of like how folks in Trentino, when the Carta de Regula system was working in these communities were self-regulating commons, right? And it's one of the conversations that we have in Karrabing. Well, how did you guys do it? Like, we do it this way. How did you do it? We do it this way. How did you do it? Right? And the conversation would be, well, they would petition the Prince Bishop for the right to self-regulate their lands. Who would self-regulate was based on Vicini and Capofuoco or Capo Familia, the male head of the family. The vedova, the widow, could also speak in the meetings in which the regulations were developed, but she was never speaking as a woman. She was speaking as her in the voice of her deceased husband, right? So it's very gendered. It was very prima genitore, and so it was families. Like, you could say, Teruin was based on descent from families, but there were no other mechanisms. There weren't mir or mintana or sweat, right? There was Vicini that descended through the father's line, and perhaps more importantly, although there was not there was the same kind of obligation to each other. You must do this in ways that we could say were similar to Karrabing. There was a initial, and then over the centuries, a hardening of confini, of borders, right? Such that in these little communities, there were the vicini, there were the families passed down, and then there were the borders. Ours, yours, right? Our lands, Corisol, Pinzola, right? And from the 14th century to the 18th century, what we see in the archives is an increasing amount of litigation between communities about where those boundaries were. That is, what we're seeing there is property. Now, it's property regulated through the common action of designated families, but it has hard boundaries, and litigation works across the boundaries. And indeed, what we see in the Alps is a reflection in these these disputes from the 1200s to the 14 release when it starts to the 1800s, a reflection both on the part of people in those communities, but also on the part of those adjudicating the disputes about the way in which property is creating dispute. Whereas before there was confini, there were boundaries, like people knew, like Corisolo, mountains and pastures, and Pinzolo and Massimilio, they knew where these were, but they also recognized and were moved and were obligated by something that we could call I vincoli intimisti. It's so a kind of intimate bond of fellowship between communities. So people used each other's stuff. This emphasis on borders and boundaries. Oh, this is just sorry. This is it doesn't matter. This is just giving you pictures of what I've been saying. This emphasis on I confini, that is the border and who belongs inside of it. Again, not nationalism and not individual possessiveness. It's communal, but it's ours versus I forestieri. It's the strangers who you might know. It's not liberal strangers. It's like you would know them. They're just across the river, but they're strangers to vicini. They don't belong. This increasing emphasis on exclusion is not something that we would say if we were comparing. It's like, oh, well, that's not something that we see in Karrabing, at least not something Karrabing sees relative to its own country. And this is because if we think about these places in terms of human relations only, human relations to each other, then we miss the ways in which for Karrabing the humans have relations to each other through geographies formed by, say, terroin, which are those beings that moved and then stiffened up. But those beings that move and stiffened up have relations to each other. That is, humans know that their relations to place or kinds of forms of existence are just one element in a world that has relations to each other, independent of whether they're humans there or not. Right? So if in Corisolo it's the humans and my borders and what's happening to us, we used to like have these intimate bonds that sure we had the borders, but we share blah 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 we. In Karrabing, there's an emphasis on remembering that human relations to country are just one little bit of a broader, crucial way in which the earth is related to each other, independent of us. And indeed, if we want to have a relationship with this particular place or set of forms of existence, if hunting, like turtles hunting, we have to let the earth have its own relation to each other, independent of us. Now, that's one way we can do it, I have to say, and this, you can see how this comparative method does allow us, I think, to begin to move away from too simple of a collapse into a shared indigeneity, right? So the discourse, say, in the white or European Counter-Reformation of, well, wait a minute, we had indigenous traditions too, or we were colonized too, right? In southern Italy, we were colonized by the North. In spaces in Eastern Europe, we were colonized by Russia, or we were also colonized. Or in Trentino, my grandfather and grandmother would say, we were colonized and dispossessed by the French, Napoleon. We had our own indigenous traditions. One of the things that the comparative method does is say, okay, but we're looking at two very different histories and two very different modes of inhabiting the earth we're kin with. But I think there's a more important way in which we have to look at this, and here's more, that's the way in which all these Karrabing forms of existence relate to humans and to each other. And just that's also, it's important that we can see how this land is formed. Like, we can see all the different beings in it because we know how to look at it. We assume you can't. This is also simply showing the effect of population mortality during, obviously, during the Carte de Regular system, and the way in which population increase also increased the confrontation and the litigation between villages and the hardening of this idea of confini or borders. But I want to just turn as a kind of way of transitioning to the end to say that this the problem with this comparative method was indicated in when I said the conversations that Karrabing and I have together when we're in Corisolo or we're in Belluin or Mabluk or wherever, have a certain kind of grammar. Yep. How did y'all relate to country, they asked me in Corisolo, and how are we attempting to keep our relations to the more than human world obligatory, compelling, and politically powerful. All right. How did you? How do we? Right. And the comparative method excludes, in crucial ways, the history, the historical effect of the sedimentations of colonialism on these two places. Right. It abstracts out to forms of existence as if they didn't exist in the actual earth as it is continually differentially sedimented by the effects of colonialism, or what I have called Geontopower. And in particular, one of the, if we remember that that Corisolo and Belluin, or any place and any place, characterized by the history of colonizer and colonized. If we remember that this is not something that is put in relation through a comparative method or put in relation by any other method, but rather is and has been in relation to each other materially since the same period that Povinelli emerged as a nickname, i.e. in the 1400s. Bartolomeo detto Povinelli, the same time that the ships were beginning to cross the Atlantic and invade the Americas. If we remember with Edouard Glissant that from that moment, we are seeing relationality, not in the abstract, but as a sedimenting force, part and parcel of which was the mobilization and weaponization of very old European philosophies. For example, the difference between life and non-life, that which has potentiality, that which can be measured, its ethical and social meaning can only be measured by its end or its death. And on the other hand, a world of the inert. Life as horizontal, the inert as frozen and past. These categories, which are very old and contested in the history of Western philosophy, were weaponized during the colonial period, such that human people, civilizations, people encountered were put into these two categories. That is, the life and the non-life, the stone and the organic, were created as a hierarchy with humans slotted according to whether Europeans saw them as more or less potentiated. And in Australia, of course, indigenous people were characterized as Stone Age, which was perfect because they could be said to be inert, to be past-looking, and thus they could be exterminated without killing them. Thus, the relation between the ongoing histories of these two places, Corisolo, Bellion, Mabuluk, have to be understood within and always in relation to this ongoing form of differentiation. Thus that now, and here I'll just kind of sum up now, as the glaciers are melting and the alpine region of Trentino and Sud-Tyrol are facing economic collapse of the ski economy, there's a sudden interest in reanimating a cultural economy, both the ecological economy, right? Biking, hiking, but suffused with a cultural economy that resurrects old or ongoing myths and legends, one of which relates to Povinelli, because Povinelli is a kind of, it comes from poina in dialect, it's kind of ricotta, and it's related to this witch's story, and the witches in Corisolo. Corisolo was one of the places that the Council of Trent put like a barrier and said, witches, you have to stay on that side and you can't come this side. But they resurrect them, but they resurrect them as fables and legends. And indeed, they resurrect them, and as they resurrect them, they sort what is truth and fact, truth as a fact, and what can be proven and not proven. But when we come to, that sits on one side of a geontological understanding of life and its sciences, its savoirs. When we come to the Bellion side, Bellion, Mabuluk, Karrabing side, their understandings of places like, their understandings of Terwin, of Mir, Mintana, and its effect on human and more than human kinship relations, these are understood as culture and belief, at least now. They were understood as symptoms of a Stone Age mentality, but now In multiculturalism, we say, oh, that's what they believe, right? Whereas Karrabing would say there were truth and fact. Thus, even now, as we see with the melting glaciers and the rising tides, the reemergence of this idea of this reemergence, mobilization of a European indigenous past, that many ecologists think that could be mobilized to as a kind of ecological politics. We still see that this European mobilization dwells within a geontological imaginary, one that insists that there are facts that relate to the things that can live and be true, and then there are merely beliefs that others hold to be true. In Karrabing, this is exactly the wrong way of thinking about things. It's not, the question is not, is Mabuluk the stiffened body of a barramundi fish passed down through fathers since the time it happened, but rather in acting on the fact that that is a fish related to another place, related to humans, acting on that fact, do we keep in place an ecology that we wouldn't if we merely thought it was a legend or a quaint belief? Thank you.
So here, thank you for the journey. I have a couple of small questions. You finished with acting on a fact. How do you make the difference between an act and a fact? Okay. In the beginning, you have used, on purpose, you said, counter-reform as a metaphor. And it's a very important, if you return in history and not in a metaphor, it's very connected with the place you are speaking, with the Conseil de Trento, the Trente. But how do you play with this metaphor? Because, okay, you have the Catholicism, you have the Reformation, and after that, from the Catholicism, you have the counter-reform. So it seems to be positive, the counter-reform, in your discourse, but in history, I'm not so sure. And you forget the last step is the secularization. And I'm not sure the state, and I'm not sure that the national state is your cup of tea, and they have always done a good job. And to continue with this, how you using a kind of symmetry principle or a kind of equal consideration when you consider the connection with these religions, confessions, with a special non-human entity, God, and the ancestor of the Karrabing, because for you, okay, you are fair with the Karrabing. I'm not so sure that you use this semi-human for the Christian entity. And I think it's enough.
Let's go. So starting with the act on the fact, right? Yes, and one of the things, of course, I should clarify is, and one should always clarify, is the conceptual framework in which the word is being used, right? So, from a pragmatist point of view, which I am, in the American pragmatist tradition, the emphasis is on a commitment to what world results from a set of semiotic associations. So if that point is interpreted as it's in me, my body, and I'll back this up in a second, a muddy or barramundi fish, then what I do in relation to it is different than if I believe it's a barramundi fish. And backing up, it's one of the reasons we try and get the kids down into their country before they can even speak, so that before they know it, their body is formed in relation to that place as a barramundi fish, so that they later can struggle to believe or not believe, but their body has nevertheless been formed in relation to a relation. And this is crucially important, because the reason we do it is that we hope that when the inevitable claws of extractive capitalism come to this area, which we can already hear them. We have the lithium mining and also water mining coming down here. That and with the mobilization, those multinational corporations mobilizing enormous amounts of money for an indigenous person, but for a company, when they say, here, we'll give you, $10,000 if you give us the rights to mine in your country, that we have formed those kids in such a way that they can't help but pause. That is, their dispositif, in the older sense, is foundationally relational to Mabuluk as a fish. Okay. That's what I mean as a fact. I mean the fact of a relational formation that then impedes or directs the tendency to act in a certain way again. Okay. Yes, the Counter-Reformation. The Counter-Reformation, so there's Reformation, there's Counter-Reformation, there's secularization. And indeed, in like where Povinelli's come from, we're just northwest of Trento. You see that, of course, played out in the histories of these villages. And secularization through really through administrative law, Napoleonic administrative law that's then in some ways attempted to be copied by the Habsburgs, creates a Catholic secular Catholicism, or because there's still like deep Catholicism there. Do I mean it simply as a metaphor? What I'm trying to say, so here I'll go. What I'm trying to think through is how do we think about the emergence of a certain kind of white nativism? Say in northern Italy, we saw it through Lega Nord. We see it in the mobilization of Celtic symbols, et cetera, et cetera. So on the right, and on the left, this desire in artistic practice, in political practice, especially amongst a lot of young people, to try and figure out how to re-belong to a place in a different way, to re-belong to the more than human world in a different way, in a non-fascist way, in a non-nationalist way. So I'm seeing these two spaces that are technically antagonistic to each other, but both in very different ways, going back to something, wanting to go back, wanting to, how are we going to even say, re-indigenize? Sometimes we hear this, re-indigenize, I'm not really sure. And that makes me wonder, what were one of the forces, what was one of the vectors compelling this movement? And from a Karrabing point of view, one of the forces is the effectiveness of colonial critique. And that's what can seem strange. It's like, well, the white nativism is the effect of colonial critique. How can that be? But if we think that colonial critique is the power of demanding that indigenous traditions or beliefs or ongoing practices stop being mined, stop being used, if there's a refusal to be used in that way, if the value structure has altered such that being indigenous has value, then suddenly, well, we're indigenous too, right? As a kind of counter, and this is where I'm saying a counter reformation, a way of trying to counter the colonial critique, which would, in the metaphor, be the Reformation, by reestablishing a form of Europeanness that has value, that has power, that has its own grounds, and et cetera, et cetera. That's what I'm doing. So, and where does that lead to a new secularization? I have no idea. One of the really interesting things about this moment is that there's something going on, and it's going on ecologically, it's going on politically, it's going on socially. There's a reorganization of markets, there's reorganization of national imaginary, secular, but we don't know what's quite emerging yet. So this is also a project that's trying to use these two places to shake the relation to, so maybe we can see what's going on. I think those are the three questions. I can't remember.
Yeah, maybe I would have one. Reflecting on what you said at the end, would you see any interest of collaboration between different sciences? I mean, because it's the kind of fact that we are trying to do in the Politics Center. So, well, these all sciences that are based on this differentiation between truth and belief.
Part of the Rising Tide Melting Glacier project on the Karrabing side sits in Mabuluk. So the location is Mabuluk, and Mabuluk is both a teruin. It's a barramundi fish. There's also a moro teruin there, but it's also the location of a network of 30 or so pre-colonial rock fish traps. And perhaps the location of some moccasin trading spots. It's located in a region where international miners are now prospecting for rare earths that could power the green energy movement. And also water prospectors, so for water extraction, because behind that coastal region are these huge wetlands that in the development imaginary are being portrayed as wasted water. So you have this idea of superabundance and waste. So on Karrabing side, one of the projects, one of the things we're trying to do is to mobilize scientific research around those rock fish traps and potential moccasin trading sites in order to create a heritage site. Because if there's one site right to the bottom of one of the teruin, then it would be pre-ocean shift. That'd be about 30,000 years old. And if it's there, and we think it might be there because that area is a long yam, dreaming, it's a kind of yam, which is now very short. And it was one of the pictures. So there's a little point, and then there's a sandbank over here. That used to be one long sandbank, pre-water shift, right, 30,000 years ago. So there might be a fish trap at the very end of that. If so, it's a World Heritage Site. Right. So Karrabing, we're like, let's go find a marine archaeologist who we can work with. And we did, and we did most of we mapped out all the places and the methodologies based on our understanding of country as formed by these terawin. So it's a fish, that's why fish trap, there are a lot of fish dreamings there. And then this long yam might indicate that there's a trap down here. But working with archaeologists demonstrates the deep geontological imaginary of the Western sciences. So at the core of what they see them having to do in order to demonstrate whether or not there is a pre-ocean shift 30,000 is to divide the land into anthropogenic and natural landscapes. And we keep on pushing back against this, and as we push back, because we say the Terwin formed the country in such a way that it told its descendants how to use the country, and kind of mapping what was already there, and plus over 30,000 years, sweat, minthara, right? And other bodily substances mix with land, human activity. So we go through all the basic principles that are not that hard to figure out, in which the land and the people and the relationships are all inside each other, sedimenting over time. As we try and do this, we hit the geontological imaginaries of the discipline, the savoirs, right? And then we also hit how the borders between the sciences, or the imaginaries of the science, here archaeology, like what is human, what is natural, what was human made, what's natural made, the nature, of course, dynamic, but in a very different way, et cetera, et cetera. The way in which it's hardened into political agencies. So in the north, you have the Department of Heritage, then you have the Sacred Sites Authority, then you have the Fishing Authority, right? And each one of them is built on the very imaginaries of Geontopower. One has to do with human activities, heritage. One has to do with humans' interactions with nature. One has to do with culture, that is, Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority has to do with belief, right? And as you attempt to mobilize, Karrabing attempts to mobilize its way of living with each other and this world, it moves around a merry-go-round of savoirs. Now, we have been somewhat effective in forcing them to see this problem, heritage and sacred sites, and right, and then trying to get them to reform themselves, decolonize themselves. So that in crucial parts is important. On the Corizolo side, as there's a number of movements to reinvigorate food practices, pasturing practices, based on traditional modes of being in the mountains. These run into, it's interesting, these run into a different set of bureaucratic problems. One, my good colleague Roberto Raffietta has talked about this in terms of the attempt to reinvigorate old cheese-making practices. There's the EU regulation about how much bacteria per section of cheese you can have. There's also the fact, and here we see the sedimentational relationality, that the Alps themselves, undergoing climate change, now have a very different bacteria profile, so that you cannot, and it's what Karrabing said, you cannot go back, right? As these relational histories sediment differently, you try and mobilize forward, but you mobilize into different kinds of administrative regimes, scientific practices, in the West, a foundational difference between a belief and a fact in certain kinds of savoirs, all of which disrupt in very concrete and practical ways the attempt to live with each other and particular places in a non-capitalist, non-possessive way.